Hi there, I'm Elizabeth Wein. I'm also a writer and a pilot. I haven't actually just got back from flying, but I thought that I would give you the full demonstration of what it looks like to be a 1930s barnstorming pilot in the white scarf, which flutters in the wind, and basically which pilots used back in the day because they were flying in open cockpit planes to clean off their goggles, which would get spattered with bugs and water and oil that might be spilling from the aircraft. Once I've gotten rid of all these things, including my 1930s style flying jacket, I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the books that I've written. And in particular, the one that I've written most recently, which is Stateless, the one you see here. And obviously, the heroine on the cover is dressed kind of like I was a minute ago. Stella North, the heroine of Stateless, is a pilot. She is flying in an air race across Europe in the 1930s. And the book is a mystery because early on in the race, Stella actually witnesses someone being murdered, and she has to figure out who's done it and if they're going to kill again. Stateless is really about a young woman who's trying to find her place in a man's world. It wasn't a very usual thing for young women to be pilots in the 1930s, and kind of unbelievably, it's still not a very usual thing for women to be pilots now, and that's partly why I write about it. I like to bring the idea of aviation into the heads of young people, not just women, but anyone of any gender, because aviation is an exciting, always changing field, and I would really like to get young people interested in it. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my books and about the writing process. And at the end of this talk, hopefully you'll know a little bit more about me. And I will also give you some writing exercises that you can do yourself. Although Stateless is my most recent book, I'm also the author of many other books for young people, including Codename Verity, which is the one that kind of made my life as a writer. And it is also about young pilots. It's set during World War II, and it's the story of the friendship between a pilot and a spy. When I was writing this book, my daughter was 12 years old, and I felt that there wasn't really any literature out there that talked about how important friendships are. I was also just learning to fly, and I was very interested and excited in the history of women in aviation. So I ended up telling the story of a woman who was dropped behind enemy lines during World War II, is captured by the Gestapo, and is forced to write a confession. And what she writes is what's in this book. Before I published Stateless, I also published The Enigma Game, which is about a bomber squadron during World War II, and about the young half Jamaican and half English girl who gets to know the young pilots who are fighting and flying for that squadron, which is based in Scotland. I wrote this book because I lived in Jamaica for 3 years when I was small, and I spent my first 3 years of school going to school in Jamaica. And I really knew what it was like to be a stranger in a strange land, to come from the Caribbean and suddenly find yourself in a place that was really very different culturally. Although it wasn't England for me, I went straight from Jamaica to Pennsylvania in the United States. But it was a much colder place. It was a complicated place because it was right at the end of the civil rights movement in the United States. So black and white race relations in the US at that time were really very fraught. And it was an interesting time to be a young person. And I drew on a lot of this when I was writing The Enigma Game in creating the character of Louisa. The Enigma Game and Stateless are both published by Bloomsbury. If you find that these books are maybe a little too long for you, try out these other three books, Firebird, White Eagles, and The Last Hawk, which are also about young people flying and which are published by Barrington Stoke, who specializes in books that are very readable and are not quite as long and are also useful for dyslexic readers. So, Stateless being my most recent book, I thought what I would talk to you about are some of the rabbit holes that I went down when I was researching it. Presumably, you've all heard of rabbit holes, internet rabbit holes. You all know what this is like. You've been told to find out what the weather report for tomorrow is. You've been told to watch the news so you can talk about it in class the next day. Or maybe you're just online looking for a new pair of shoes or a new backpack or something like that. Suddenly, before you know it, you're not looking at the Met Office website. You're watching a video where a whole bunch of Welsh shepherds are attaching Christmas lights to their sheep and making pretty pictures out of them. Or you're reading a subreddit that is talking about romance between a couple of characters in the Avengers who have never actually met each other. Or you're watching a version of Titanic where the character of Rose has been replaced by a cat. These are the kind of rabbit holes that I'm talking about. And believe it or not, even when I, who have had many years of experience at this kind of thing, am doing research, I find myself vanishing down these same rabbit holes. The term comes from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where, of course, Alice does actually go down a rabbit hole because she's curious and she finds all kinds of bizarre things at the other end. So it's a very apt description of what happens to us when we start looking for things on the internet. Now, because my books are set during World War II, I obviously, or even earlier, Stateless is set in 1937, I obviously have to do a lot of research when I'm working on them. Now, I wrote Stateless mostly during the pandemic lockdown of 2020, and then again, I was revising it in 2021, and I didn't have a lot of opportunity to go out and visit museums or libraries or archives or to talk to people, which is what I would normally be doing if I were working on a book. I like to get very hands-on with my research. So I did a lot of surfing the internet when I was trying to find out what kinds of things I should be looking for in telling a story that was set during 1937. And some of the rabbit holes that I found myself down seemed to be so obscure that I actually kept a list of them. And that's what I'm going to share with you right now. It's called my Stateless Rabbit Holes list, quite straightforward, and I'm just going to read it to you. History of picnic tables. 1930s leather flight jackets. Luftwaffe mess dress. European time zones, 1937. Coca-Cola in Nazi Germany. Zeppelins. Recordings of Woody Guthrie's Battle of Harama. Construction of cigarette lighters. The floor of an Avro Cadet biplane. Sunset times in Brussels for September 1937. The distance from Maidenhead to St. Petersburg. Belgian telephone kiosks. A Frenchman named Raphael Élysée, who was the first black man to become a mayor in modern metropolitan France. A film called White Night with Mikhail Baryshnikov. The diamond tile roof of Dijon Cathedral, the source of the Thames. Robo-dwarf hamsters. The history of stopwatches. Swiss, German, and Belgian breakfasts. Dog racing. I don't even know why I was looking up dog racing. I kept this list as I was writing the book, and there's no dog racing in the book. So I don't know why it's on the list, but apparently I did actually wind up finding out about it. Also, the history of streetlights, because the kids in the book are running around at night in a strange city, and I wondered how the streets were lighted. Like, did they have electric light? Did they have electric light in some cities and not others? Did they use gaslight as well as electric light? So these were things that I didn't think about until I came across them as I was writing. And then I thought, oh no, I need to find this out, or it's not going to be accurate. Iconic buses of the interwar years. Please, how do you find that out? Italian telephone tokens. And finally, the United Kingdom's government website for Home Office guidance on interviewing suspects. Because it's a mystery, and some of the suspects needed to be interviewed, and I needed to get it right. In happier times, for my previous books, I would have done a lot of hands-on research, and I still like to do a lot of hands-on research. So in trying to get you to work on some writing of your own, what I am going to share with you is some of my writing artifacts that I have picked up over the years. And most of them are something to do with aviation. So your writing prompt from me will necessarily be about flying, but of course, if that doesn't interest you, you can really put your own twist on things. Write about driving if that's something you're learning to do, or if it's something you hate doing. Don't forget that just because a story is about someone who flies, it doesn't mean that they enjoy flying. And indeed, one of my earlier books, Black Dove, White Raven, had a heroine who really didn't like flying and ended up having to do it in order to save the day at the end of the novel. What you see behind me is not just a pretty picture, it's actually a map of Northeast England, and it is a pilot's map published by the Royal Air Force in the 1930s. So a map like this is what my characters in Stateless would have been using. And getting my hands on something like this, getting my hands on a map that shows me the different details that these characters would have been having to deal with, makes it really come alive to me. Did you know that the direction for magnetic north moves? Aviation maps are reprinted every couple of years because true north and magnetic north are not lined up, and it changes over time. So this map also contains some information as to how much you can expect your compass setting to deviate. And of course, what's north on this map is really different from north on maps today. So this is my gas mask bag. And it does not have a gas mask in it. It has in it some of my other artifacts. One of these is, because I write about aircraft, I have a lot of replica books that are pilot's notes for Royal Air Force aircraft during World War II. This one is for a Lysander, which is kind of the star airplane of codename Verity. It was a plane that's called a short takeoff and landing plane, and they were able to take off in such a short distance and to land in such a short distance that they used them to make night landings in occupied countries, in enemy occupied countries. And they would stand there using a torch as a landing light, just flashing it on first as they heard the plane coming over, which would have no lights on it, so they could only hope that it was not an enemy aircraft. And when they saw it coming over, they would flash Morse code to let them know where the landing site was. And if the aircraft overhead didn't flash back the correct code, they would not turn the lights on to let them land. So this is a book that just tells you how to fly a Lysander, and here we have a diagram of the what the cockpit would look like. Really useful, actually, if you're writing a book about a Lysander and you want to know what it looks like if you're flying the plane. This is, as I say, this is just a replica. You can find these anywhere online, and you can find them in museums, places like the Imperial War Museum, and sometimes even local museums or air museums will sell books like this, and other interesting replicas such as ration books and books of ration tickets and recipes from wartime. So stuff that can be actually very useful if you're trying to do research. And that is a book. So that's a book that tells you all about flying a Lysander. Oops, it's upside down. All about how to fly a Lysander. If you were an air transport auxiliary pilot, like one of the characters in Codename Verity, you would have had to fly lots of different types of aircraft. And as a ferry pilot, that kind of pilot, instead of having a book like that to show you how to fly one type of aircraft, you would have had this ferry pilot's notes. And inside it, it shows you how to fly many, many different types of aircraft, all the different types of aircraft that were being used during World War II by the Royal Air Force. So everything you needed to know about flying a Lysander would be held on just this card, and just this one side of the card. The back of it is blank. So I think that's an amazing contrast, and something you wouldn't really necessarily think about. If you were a combat pilot flying a plane, you had this whole book to study. And if you were an air transport auxiliary pilot, a ferry pilot, just maybe taking it away to be mended or delivering it to the pilot who would fly it, this is all you would get. And this tells you how to take off, how to land, and what to do if there's an emergency. It doesn't tell you anything else. So this little book, which is also a facsimile, so it's not an original, but you can see originals in museums. If you are anywhere near Maidenhead in southern England, the Air Transport Auxiliary Museum there has lots of things that are relevant to these pilots, who were both men and women during the war. They assisted the Royal Air Force in the jobs they did, and they acted as support for them, but they were just civilian pilots. So they're the kind of people who would be carrying their gas mask in this kind of a bag. Another interesting thing, and this was a rabbit hole for me, was my character in Codename Verity that I told you about, who is having to write her confession for the Gestapo. I thought, what would she be writing with? Would she be writing with a ballpoint pen, a biro, a Bic? Probably not, but what would she be writing with? Well, she could be writing with a pencil, just like you and me. And pencils really haven't changed very much in the past 150 years. So that was one option. But she wouldn't be writing with a ballpoint pen or a rollerball pen. She'd be writing with a bottle of ink and an ink pen that she would have to dip into ink. A lot of times when you talk to older people, and certainly if you ask your grandparents about this, they may well remember having to write with ink and a pen that you dip in the ink when they were in school. Even in some schools, when that became obsolete, they made children write with ink pens to try to improve their handwriting. That was not done to me. I was not forced to write with an ink pen. This bottle, incidentally, I found on an airfield when I was learning to fly. The flying club where I was getting my instruction decided they were going to improve one of their runways. And so everybody went out and had to pick rocks. Basically, we went out and we decided we were going to clear the runway of rocks because it had been used as a plowed field before. And so there we were, going up and down this runway looking for basically rocks and loading them into wheelbarrows. And I found this old ink bottle, which was presumably used by a pilot or some administrator on the airfield many, many years earlier, before the invention of the ballpoint pen. And it turns out that the ballpoint pen, and I have a very, very early one, I have two very early ones here. These are probably the oldest ballpoint pens that you are likely to see. They date to about 1945. And the ballpoint pen was invented by a man named Laszlo Biro, who was Hungarian and was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And he sold his patent to a British aircraft company called Miles Martin, and they started manufacturing this pen. I have one more thing to show you from my gas mask bag, and it is this, which is another map. But this map is rather special because it is what's called an escape map. This map, try to show you a better view of it. This map would have been part of an airman's kit. So not just a pilot, but maybe a tail gunner, maybe a navigator, maybe a wireless operator. They would have an escape kit in case they were shot down over enemy territory, and they still will have an escape kit. Operational pilots, including maps, much like this. This one, the map itself is just based on a 1930s bicycle map, but it's printed on silk for a number of reasons. One is if you are an escaped shot down airman trying to escape from enemy territory, you don't want to be making a lot of noise. That map sounds just like paper. It will make this kind of a noise if you get it out of your pocket, if you fold it, and if you get it wet, it will fall apart like paper. This map is really quite silent. If you crinkle it up and shove it in your pocket, no one will see. It will bounce back afterwards. It won't be ruined. If it gets wet, the ink's not going to run, the map's not going to disintegrate. An interesting feature of it, you'll see that the top half of it is all white, and you can actually tell that there's a very straight line where the picture is cut off. Now, I don't know if you can, this is a map of France and the lowland countries, and I don't know if you can tell here, but what you're looking at right here is the tip of southern England. The whole of the top of the map has been blanked out so that if this map does fall into enemy hands, they're not going to be able to use it. They're not going to be able to find their way to London or any other big British city by looking at this blank map. But the airman who may be trying to find his way out of France will be able to use it to do that. It even shows the ferry routes, although the ferries weren't running then. But if he got that far, he might be able to get somebody to give him a lift in a boat. And the final thing that I loved about this map is that if you were caught with one of them on you, it could give you away as an evader or as a spy. So you had to be very careful that nobody discovered you had one of these maps. And there was a woman who was in France as a spy who found herself at a roadblock where they were doing ID checks, and she had one of these maps with her. And as she stood in the queue, she thought, oh no, what am I going to do? They'll find that I have this map and they'll know that I'm a spy in enemy territory. So she took it out of her pocket while she was waiting in the queue to have her ID checked, and she tied it in her hair like so, And then when it came her turn to speak to the people at the front of the queue, she handed over her fake ID and she smiled sweetly and she chatted and laughed and they waved her goodbye and off she went. And I love that because nobody ever looked at the scarf in her hair and thought, oh, that must be an escape map. But I often will wear it in my hair when I'm doing a talk for a school visit or sometimes to older people, a workshop for them, and nobody ever notices that I'm wearing a World War II escape map in my hair. So, what I would like you to do now is to go down some rabbit holes of your own. First, make a list of objects. Make a list of things that interest you. Put 10 things on this list just to start with. You don't need to have a list that's quite as long as the rabbit hole list that I read to you a little bit earlier. My suggestion is that you take some of the things that I've been talking about here to make that list, because what would be ideal would be for you to write a couple of paragraphs, maybe the beginning of a story, maybe a newspaper article, but something that was set during a different time period. And obviously I've been talking about the Second World War in the 1930s, so that would be the obvious time period to choose. But if that doesn't really interest you, or you feel you don't know enough about it, or you are reluctant to try to imagine stuff about a time that you don't know very much about, then please do pick some other time period. Nevertheless, I'd still like you to use some of these objects. So I'll remind you again what they are. You can put some of these on your list. Escape map that's made out of silk and looks like a scarf. A list for ferry pilots showing them how to fly 150 different airplanes. A gas mask bag. Where would this have been found? Who would have used it? An ink bottle. Once you've written down 5 or 10 objects that you think you could maybe weave into a story, what I'd like you to do is choose 3 of them, just 3. And with those 3 objects, try to create a little history. Who used these things? Where and why were they important? How did they change that person's life? What will happen to them in the future? Every object tells a story. There's a story behind every one of the things that I've shown to you right now. And really, all that I do as a writer, and all I did when I wrote the book Stateless, is I took all those things that I wrote about. I took all those things that I found out about, the list of rabbit holes that I read to you, and I wove them into a story. I wove them into a story about a group of young people who are in competition with each other, who are scared of each other because they think one of them is a murderer, and who are trying to find out truth and who are trying to become friends. And I think that's kind of what we're all after, isn't it? Trying to find out really what's going on around us and hoping that we'll meet some people on the way who will help us to make sense of what's going on. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I hope you're inspired to go read Stateless, and I hope that you're inspired to do some writing of your own. Get your ink bottle, get your pen, and get writing. Enjoy Camp YA. This is Elizabeth Wein, and I've enjoyed talking to you.